What in your life are you finding difficult at the moment? It's never really that difficult to answer that question. There's always something, isn't there, that's hard. Perhaps for you at the moment, it's to do with the coronavirus. Perhaps you yourself have it and you're suffering with it. Perhaps someone you love has it and you're finding it difficult to know that they're so ill. Perhaps you're even grieving the loss of a loved one. On the other hand, maybe you don't have it, no one close to you has it, but you are struggling with the realities of lockdown. You're struggling with social isolation. Perhaps it's another offspin of this crisis. Your job is under threat, your income is under threat, or even those things are gone, and you're wondering where the money's going to come from. Of course, at the same time, it could be something unconnected to this virus. It could just be that you've got an ongoing illness, an ongoing financial problem, an ongoing family problem, whatever it may be. But there is something that is difficult for you. As the Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Philippi, he was in what was a really difficult circumstance. He was imprisoned. His freedom had been taken away. We actually discover as the letter goes on that he was facing a trial, the outcome of which could potentially be the death penalty. That's pretty tough to face. Now, thankfully, he had Christians who were very supportive of him, such as the church in Philippi. But there were professing, at least, believers not far from him and in his locality who were trying to make life worse for him. That's pretty tough, isn't it? But what we've seen is that whilst, of course, there is a place for lament in the Christian life, and quite rightly so, as a Christian, Paul can always find things to rejoice in. He could rejoice in his imprisonment because it meant that the prison guards were hearing the gospel. He could rejoice even in the fact that there were some Christians trying to make life harder for him, because one of the things they were doing to try and make life harder was preaching the gospel themselves. Well, at least the gospel was being preached, and Paul could rejoice in that. He even has other reasons to rejoice. I'm going to read now from Philippians chapter 1, and from the end of verse 18 and then on through verse 19. Here's what Paul says. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice, because I know this will lead to my salvation through your prayers and help from the Spirit of Jesus Christ. So, very quickly, Paul is determined to rejoice no matter what his circumstances, because he knows that there are always things to rejoice about. He's even rejoicing because he says, I know that this, and this was his current suffering, his imprisonment. I know that this will lead to my salvation. Not just this is something that I just have to get past in order to get to my salvation. No, this very difficult thing I'm going through will lead to my salvation. How so? Well, difficult circumstances, trying things, they have a habit of pushing us towards Jesus, don't they, as Christians? They draw us closer to him as we have to lean upon him and depend upon him. Our salvation ultimately will reach its completion when we are face to face with Jesus, as near as we can possibly be. But difficulties draw us steadily closer to him. They lead to our salvation. Another aspect of salvation is that when it is fully achieved, we are fully like Jesus. Now, suffering has a way of knocking off the hard edges from us. It's kind of the friction, if you like, that polishes the diamond. So this suffering Paul is going through, it will lead to his salvation. And he rejoices in that. He doesn't rejoice in the circumstance itself, the suffering itself, but in where it leads to salvation. Being with Christ, being like Christ. But there are two particular factors that make this suffering lead to his salvation. The prayers of other believers. So one of the dangers of suffering is that we collapse into self-pity. Don't do that. See that actually it's leading to your salvation, and then think of others who are suffering hard things and pray for them, that their difficult things will lead to their salvation too. They'll draw nearer to Jesus, they'll become more like Jesus. But our prayers, of course, can be fickle. Sometimes we remember to pray, sometimes we don't. But there's something else that's even more sure, that makes sure that these things lead to salvation. And that is help from the Spirit of Jesus Christ. In our sufferings, the Spirit is with us. He leads us through these things such that they lead us to Christ. And he never, ever fails to do that. Isn't that something to rejoice in?